We're going to continue in our book reading, The Black Pope, A History of the Jesuits by M.F. Cusack. She was formerly the Nun of Kinmar. We're in chapter 10. The heading, The Spanish Armada and the Jesuits. The Spanish Armada and the Jesuits, the Pope's one idea to re-enslave England, England's unique position, Cardinal Manning commends the gunpowder plot conspirators, Englishmen must clearly understand Roman Catholic principles and motives, the Pope's claim to temporal power, the Civilita Catholica, Jesuit plots in England, the Jesuit, the wandering Jew of the Romanist Church, Queen Elizabeth wished to exercise toleration towards her Roman Catholic subjects, the Jesuits tried to assassinate Elizabeth, Roman Catholics had liberty to practice their religion privately under Elizabeth. Elizabeth inclined to clemency. Mary, Queen of Scots. Philip of Spain. The Armada, a Jesuit plot. Execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. The Jesuits persecute the Pope and the King of Spain of men and money. Both are unwilling to act. The Pope, angry and hysterical, throws his plates and dishes about, refuses to give money till the expedition has started. Everything planned by the Jesuits, who were sure of success. Cardinal Allen's proclamation. The Pope can make or unmake sin. Elizabeth would have been his dearest daughter if she had placed herself and her kingdom at his feet. The Armada defeated in spite of relics and prayers to the Virgin. Here we go. This is a long chapter, by the way, kids, brothers and sisters. It's a long chapter. All right. To obtain control of England has been the one absorbing idea of the papal court since the Reformation freed us from its yoke. Indeed, Rome has always had a quarrel on hand with this country, for history records the determined resistances which the people of England, even when Roman Catholic, made again and again to the encroachments of Rome, and at a time when Rome held her own all over the Christian world. There are many reasons why Rome greatly desires to govern us. England has a position unique in the history of nations. France is complimented on occasion as the eldest daughter of the church. But from time to time, the daughter has proved unfilial and refractory and has more than once thrown off the papal yoke. France cannot be depended upon as an appanage to the Holy See, and the Holy See knows it. Germany may support Rome politically for a moment, but Germany is not Catholic or likely to become so. Italy has spoken for herself, or rather has tried too long by papal government to submit to it again, unless let me reread that completely over again. Forgive me, guys. Germany may support Rome politically for a moment, but Germany is not Catholic or likely to become so. Italy has spoken for herself, or rather has been tried too long by papal government to submit to it again, unless under military compulsion, which the Pope would use if he could find fitting tools for his purpose. Might not England, if once under the control of Rome, be made to play the part of compulsory dictator? It would be the duty of England if Catholic. England is rich. She holds under her hand nations and principalities which are mines of wealth, and whole vast populations might be compelled to bend to the papal power if once her army was placed at the disposal of Roman cardinals. England has a prestige all her own. The people of England are reliable and not given to sudden change. But it may be said that such a change as that which is here suggested would not be possible at the present day. Events move quickly in this 19th century. Already a noble lord, openly and without reproach, has made statements to the property of the Church of England, which would have cost him his lordly head in Tudor times. He has declared that the property of the established church is really the property of the Church of Rome. It matters little whether this statement was made as an unworthy attempt to obtain popularity and continuance in office through the voters of the persuasion which he seems so anxious to accommodate with the money of the nation, or whether the statement is the result of his own convictions. We are only concerned with the fact that such a statement could be made publicly at the present day. To say the least, it is ominous of coming changes. Canada, through her two complacent politicians, has already handed over large sums of money to the Jesuits, which they claim as restitution of church property. And this is not all. Another noble lord has publicly declared in his corporate capacity, and with the express approval of many clergymen of the Church of England, that he desires to have England placed once more under the spiritual guidance of the Pope. And it is no secret that all this encouragement has impressed the present head of the Roman Catholic Church and has led him to hope that what was not accomplished by violence in the reign of Elizabeth may be accomplished by diplomacy in the reign of Victoria. Hence, it is of importance that the manner and methods which have been employed in the past for the subjugation of England to the papacy should be fully understood, even if the subject was not so intimately connected with the history of the Jesuits. It may be said that the methods of the times of the gunpowder plot and of the Spanish Armada would not be practiced now. Roman Catholic authorities do not think so, and they are surely the best authority as to the plans and beliefs of their church. The late Cardinal Manning, who was a Catholic first and an Englishman after, as indeed every good English Catholic is bound to be, has spoken very plainly on this subject. And if in the near future Englishmen find themselves under papal control or driven to deadly warfare to free themselves from it, they cannot reproach Rome with having deceived them as to her intentions. No words can be plainer than the words which Rome uses at the present day. No authority can be higher than the authority which has made the statements which we quote. There is no uncertainty when Rome declares her opinions officially. The cardinal has frankly given the special reason why Rome desires to conquer England and subdue it. He says, quote, "If ever there was a land in which work was to be done and perhaps much to suffer, it is here, England. Where it, heresy, conquered in England, it would be conquered throughout the world. All its lines meet here, and therefore in England, the Church of God must be gathered in all its strength," unquote. This is plain language, because it proves how fully Rome realizes the importance of converting England to her interest and of placing England once more under papal rule. Nor can it be said that Rome has hoped without cause. We have but glanced at two sources of encouragement on the part of leading Englishmen who would appear to emulate their Roman brethren in looking to the advancement of the Church of Rome first, and to the good of their native land a long way after. It is noteworthy also that these men too often agree with Rome in her appreciation of those of her members who suffered their... Let me reread it. It is noteworthy also that these men too often agree with Rome in her appreciation of those of her members who suffered for disloyalty to their country, but when Rome would fain reckon as martyrs to her faith. Cardinal Manning commends the rebellious Becket and the arrogant Aslam as model Englishmen because they were loyal to a foreign power. He commends the men who suffered justly for the gunpowder plot as true heroes and holds them up to the admiration of the rising generation. It is noteworthy that the service for the commemoration of our deliverance from the same plot has of late years been disused, principally, if not exclusively, through the influence of those who have expressed their preference for Roman customs, and Roman doctrine so openly as to give rise to grave suspicion as to whether they are not themselves not only of the opinion of the lapsed cardinal, but also secret members of his faith. It is extremely difficult for an honest Englishman to understand a divided allegiance, and Rome has greatly profited by this difficulty. To an Englishman who fights openly for the cause which he espouses and always says so, it is almost incomprehensible that others should act differently. But it is all the more desirable that Englishmen should very clearly understand the principles and motives of Roman Catholics. It is no reproach to a Roman Catholic to say that he is true to his own principles, but it is very important that we should very clearly understand what these principles are. The sooner and more clearly it is understood that the canon law of the Church of Rome only tolerates civil law when it is practiced in complete subjection to canon law, the better for all concerned. This is, after all, by carrying out the teaching of the Church of Rome to its inevitable and logical end. If Rome's contention is admitted that the canon law is God's law and exercised by divine right, it is self-evident that all other laws holds its authority by mere delegation. Hence the claims of the popes, not only in the past, but at the present day, to depose kings and to permit, and by permitting to encourage, the assassination of rulers who disobey her mandates. Every Roman Catholic subject of the Queen or of any other power is first a subject of the Pope. That is to say, if there should be any conflict of obedience between the two powers, obedience to the Pope comes first. And not only does it come first, but such obedience is a solemn religious duty. The Pope bases his claim to temporal sovereignty on the ground of his spiritual sovereignty. The conclusion, as we have said, is perfectly logical. But what of those who, from indifference or prejudice, deny the temporal power, while they admit or encourage papal claims to spiritual power, though they would scarcely care to submit to the Pope's temporal sovereignty? It is true that some English Catholics, as, for example, at the time of the Spanish Armada, may have given their loyalty to their country first. But no English Catholic dare act in this manner at the present day. Circumstances alter cases. The realization that the Pope is personally infallible by divine right, and this infallibility is an article of faith as much binding on the faithful Catholic as a believer in the existence of God, adds enormously to the importance of papal pronouncements. Indeed, the Pope's personal and political infallibility is taught in Roman Catholic catechisms approved by the Holy See in the United States. Hence, for example, if the United States went to war with England, American Roman Catholics would be obliged to fight on and help whichever side the Pope chooses. There is no personal liberty of any kind allowed in the Church of Rome. The English Roman Catholic who took the side of England against Spain had not the full opportunity of knowing the papal desires which he would certainly have at the present day. Communication with Rome was slow and difficult. Roman Catholics in England were comparatively isolated. They may have doubted. Certainly they took the benefit of whatever doubt there might have been. At the present day, such doubt would be impossible. Again, at that time, English public opinion was against Rome. Today, public opinion is to a large extent expressly impressed by Rome. The pressure of excommunication, which Rome has never been slow to use, either in the past or present, would soon be brought to bear with terrific force on any English Roman Catholic who took the side of his country when his country took a side against Rome, or even against what Rome decided. Go to the Civil War and look at that. It is also difficult for an Englishman to understand that what he calls toleration or considers a favor where Rome claims are concerned is not accepted as a favor by that church and is never accepted as toleration. Any larger liberty granted to Roman Catholics, whether political or social, is considered by them simply as a right. No thanks are due, and none need to be expected. unless indeed policy may suggest some appearance of gratitude, which is not and cannot be felt. On the contrary, if all the revenues of the Church of England were handed over today to Roman cardinals, those said doing individuals who suggest such a course would find to their surprise that far from receiving thanks, they would be informed that they only deserved punishment for having kept Rome out of her rights so long. The Pope's claim to temporal power being an admitted doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church, Catholics must give their first temporal allegiance to Rome, no matter what may be their nationality. Roma locta est causa est finita is an axiom as much enforced today as when it was first propounded. But while the church can always bind in temporals as well as in spirituals, she can never be bound. It is part of the divine right under which she claims to govern the world that she can be subject to none, while all must be subject to her. She also logically the sole arbitrator of the manner in which her rights shall be enforced. Let me read that again. She is also logically the sole arbitrator of the manner in which her rights shall be enforced. Today, she may secure what she claims to be her divine power by fair means, by persuasion or influence. Tomorrow, she may put to the sword all who dare to disobey her, and still she is answerable to none. If people but realize to the full the power which Rome claims and the right she claims as to its exercise, they would be slow indeed before they strengthened her hands or gave her the power to bind them in fetters from which they may never obtain release. We do not enter into the proofs of the statement which are made above, as it will probably be more satisfactory to the reader to place them in the appendix. It will be seen there how abundant and undeniable is the evidence. Also, it will be seen that the Jesuits are the special defenders of the papal claims to personal and universal sovereignty. The Jesuits have writers everywhere to uphold this doctrine, and the Civilita Catholica is the special and papal organ for the exponent of papal claims. It would be impossible to enter here into the political state of England when the Jesuits planned and carried out the plot for the subjugation of England to the Pope through the hoped for success of the Spanish Armada. The discovery of state papers and the perfect freedom granted in England for their publication has enabled the present generation to form opinions from facts. It is a curious and remarkable fact that the Jesuits were not allowed in England during the reign of the Roman Catholic Mary. Cardinal Pole, who knew them well, had a deep distrust of them, and like others of his religion and profession, thought that one cardinal would govern with more advantage to the church than a dozen Jesuits who would act as spies on his conduct if they observed their rule faithfully. Ireland has always been used by the papal court as a stepping stone to effecting a landing in England, and accordingly, in 1550, Davis Wolfe, a Jesuit, was sent to that hapless country. A bishop and 2 other Jesuits followed 3 years later. But a far more important step was taken when Father Chiniwidge was sent to England on the plea that his health required a return to his native air. Who, it was asked, could be so unjust or ungenerous as to refuse a temporary shelter to one who only asked to recruit a shattered constitution. In 1551, a certain Father Sandon, who was sent to Scotland to encourage Mary, Queen of Scots, and to obtain reliable information as to her position and prospects. But the Jesuit father was discovered and obliged to leave the country, not, however, without having seen Mary 3 times and obtaining all the information of which he had been sent. But the great danger to England was from the seminary priests, who were under the complete control and guidance of the Jesuits. Of the seminary priests, William Allen was the chief. He was an Englishman, a man's foe a man's foes are often those of his own household. Amen. It is a mistake to suppose that those who differ from us are all actuated either by mercenary or irreligious motives. Religious fanaticism is responsible for the greatest evils which the world has ever seen. And fanatics, with a very few exceptions, are men who believe in their religion, whatever it may be, and will suffer for it to the death. Allen believed in his religion. He believed in the order to which he had joined himself. The great idea of the Jesuit had always been a universal spiritual monarchy in which, being into the Jesuit should reign supreme. England has always been the place desired for the base of the operations necessary for this end. Hence, the blood, the tears shed, the schemes undertaken in this country by the Jesuit. He has by no means ended his efforts for the subjugation of the world to Rome through England. On this subject, so important to us, more shall be said later. In the reign of Elizabeth, the attempt was made through the plots to murder her, of course, for the good of the church, and anything which might help, however remotely, to this end was eagerly availed of. The English Roman Catholics did not like these schemes. The English Catholics did not like the Jesuits, but the Jesuits were a united body. They had the ear of the Pope at Rome. They had power. They had prestige. They were always in evidence. Above all, they had and had enormous wealth at their command. The parish priest was confined to his parish. He could not run over to Rome or to Douai or to Paris as he pleased. The other religious orders were located in certain places and could not leave their monasteries without difficulty or special permission. But it was not so with the Jesuit. He was the freelance of the church. While it was the business of the parish priest to look after the interests of his particular flock and of the monk to work in his particular monastery, the Jesuit had the world for his parish and any house where he could obtain an entrance for his monastery. It is true that he could only move on the chessboard of his society at the express will of a superior, but it was the express will of his superiors that he should be in the front of every movement which promised to increase the power of the church and of the order. He had a large field of labor, and he occupied it. When the Jesuit is expelled from one place, he is not slow to find another. France may reject him, not without cause, but England opens her arms to him. Catholic Italy may deprive him of the glories of his once famous home in the Gesù, but America opens her doors to him. He is the wandering Jew or the Romanist church. Of the Romanist church. He is followed by the excretions of those by whom he was once beloved until they discovered his iniquities. It is an historical fact that Queen Elizabeth was most desirous to exercise the utmost toleration towards her Roman Catholic subjects. It was only when they were required by their Roman Catholic superiors to become rebels against her lawful authority that she exercised her right as a sovereign to protect her person, her throne, and her subjects for their disloyal plots. The Jesuits were naturally the great movers in the rebellion against their queen. Their motive was twofold. Pope Pius V had excommunicated Queen Elizabeth by a bull issued on the 4th of February, 1570. And the Jesuits were bound to carry out their vow of obedience to the Pope to the bitter end, and to see that this excommunication bore fruit. It was not possible, as it would have been in earlier times, to bring the excommunicated queen to the scaffold, but it was possible to attempt to assassinate her privately. And the Jesuits set all their most skilled men to work to accomplish this object. A great deal has been said and a great deal has been written on this subject. The facts are not denied because they are too evident. But on the Catholic side, the men who died for their treasonable practices are called martyrs and applauded to the highest heavens by English Roman Catholics, even at the present day. By honest men, they are simply reprobated as traitors who met the doom which they courted and deserved. The difference of opinion is worth consideration. History repeats itself. Evidences are not wanting that efforts are being made at the present moment to set aside the Protestant succession to the throne. It is true that the attempts to announce and honor a new line of kings of England are apparently insignificant in the extreme, but things are not always what they seem. It is significant that such an attempt should be possible. It is significant that such public efforts are being made to overthrow the established church at the same time. We point to this simply as a sign of the times, without any reference to the rights or wrongs of these efforts against the Church of England. It may be said that any attempt to change the dynasty of England at the present day is too impossible to be worthy of note. A straw is insignificant, but it serves on occasion to show which way the wind blows. There are a good many straws blowing about just now, if people would only see them. Besides, small beginnings often have great endings. If Rome cannot bend a dynasty to her will, she will leave no means unused to break the dynasty. Elizabeth was cursed by the Pope with all the powers which he possessed to curse. The Jesuit, as the special servant of the Pope, was bound to leave nothing undone to make the curse a success. It was his duty. It would seem that his duty was a pleasure. The Pope could only curse. He could not command the civil power, as he had done in past ages, to execute his vengeance on the object of his displeasure. The Jesuits, his military organization, undertook that task. If they failed, it was not for want of loyal efforts to succeed. There were two ways in which the Pope's curse could be made effective. One way was by the assassination of Elizabeth. The Jesuits, as we shall show later, tried to do this. The other way was by attacking her throne through a foreign foe. The Jesuits tried this also. It was a dicta of the famous O'Connell that there was no fool so dangerous as a pious fool. We may perhaps be allowed to say there is no fanatic so dangerous as a sincere fanatic. Fanatics, with few exceptions, are sincere. And here we find a key which explains Roman Catholic disloyalty. Roman Catholics had maintained that the executions of their co-religionists, which took place in the reign of Queen Elizabeth, were executions for their religion, and reproached Protestants with cruelty and religious persecution. If ever there was a case in which men were executed and executed justly for treason against their lawful sovereign and country, the case is that of the Roman Catholics, who paid the penalty for their crimes of disloyalty in the reign of Elizabeth. These Jesuits came to England with the deliberate purpose of carrying out the effects of the excommunication which had been pronounced by the Pope. Elizabeth had been cursed by the Pope, and the Jesuits were the chosen instruments of carrying out the effects of this curse. She was no longer a queen, but a woman, whom it was their duty to murder as soon as she could be murdered. She was no longer the lawful ruler of the fair realm of England. She was an outcast, against whom every man was bound to raise his hand, who believed in the power of the Pope to make or unmake kings at his pleasure. This is a question about which there could be no dispute. It is a question of today as well as a question of yesterday. More so, the past is past. But the Pope of today claims the same power. And the Mannings and the Howards and the Ardenals and the Vaughans are as much bound to do their duty to the Pope first as were the Jesuits who compassed the destruction of Elizabeth by assassination and by war. They must be loyal to the Pope first. And if loyalty to the Pope conflicts for a moment with loyalty to the Queen, they have no choice as to which they shall obey. There is ample evidence that Elizabeth gave large and free liberty to Roman Catholics to practice their religion, at least privately, but they wanted liberty to deprive her of her crown in order to rule England through a Roman Catholic dynasty. Rather, England desired it or not. Elizabeth punished disloyalty to her throne and punished it justly. If the punishments were barbarous, it can only be said that the age was barbarous and she simply allowed the law to take the usual course. Further, Roman Catholics, when in power, inflicted even more barbarous punishments on Protestants. But there is evidence that Elizabeth was inclined to the side of mercy until the discovery of Babington's plot to murder Elizabeth and make Mary on the throne of England. Tichborne, one of his accomplices, Tichborne. He's the one that came up with that false manuscript. Isn't he? Huh. All right, let me keep going. Tischenborn, one of his accomplices, did not pretend that he was innocent, but said he expected to be forgiven. So notorious was the clemency of the Tudor queen. In September 1586, when the plotters were executed and usual barbarities were carried out to the letter, and the men were cut down alive and disemboweled, but Elizabeth gave orders that the men who were reserved for execution on the following day were to be hung till they were dead. Indeed, Babington actually wrote to Elizabeth the day before his execution, imploring her clemency. But neither executions or intimidations could restrain the impetuous Jesuit. If the plans for the assassination of the excommunicated Elizabeth failed, all the more reason they should stir up a war in which they were sure that the saints and the Virgin were on their side. They held the strings of 3 puppets in their skillful hands. Philip of Spain, who was dazzled by the hope of securing the English crown, if not by an alliance with Elizabeth, then by conquest. Pope Sixtus V, who was bound at least to appear anxious to secure England for Rome. Lastly, Mary, Queen of Scots, who was beating her somewhat soiled plumage against the bars of her cage. But there were difficulties. Mary was too impetuous and received humiliations from her Jesuit advisors, which must have been very galling to her. She was told by Father Marlicio to take care what she was doing. She must not offend the Catholic powers. She forgot the risk which others run in serving her. She must beware, or she will ruin herself fatally. She thinks only of her own misfortunes. Nay, it is even hinted very broadly that she is not as good a Catholic as she should be, and that there are those who will not be sorry if she gives them an excuse to complain of her. She had not trained her son as she should have done, and he was therefore doubtful and unreliable as a Roman Catholic. And lastly, the King of Spain cannot be made a laughingstock by failure. If he sends an imperfectly provided army to England and the enemies of God go to war with him. The view taken by the Jesuit as to the enemies of God is amusing. No doubt he believed, as a good Catholic and still more as a good Jesuit, that every Englishman was bound to join the Spanish invasion and the moment it appeared on the shores of Old England. But did he really suppose that the enemies of God would sit down quietly and let every foreigner capture their native land? We shall give at least a considerable part of the Pope's bull of excommunication, which made this Spanish invasion justifiable and even a duty in the eyes of Romanists. We may add that our authority for the above letter and the extracts which follow are the state papers which are given in Freud's History of England. All these he verified personally. Philip was not very much inclined to push matters on for the conquest of England. One reason was that he needed money. Another reason was that he had just received the present of an old, or shall we say new, relic, which absorbed his thoughts and his devotions. Cardinal de Medici had presented him with a fragment of the broken shoulder bone of St. Lawrence. The corresponding fragment had been long the most precious of the Spanish objects of religious worship. This saint was the particular saint of the king, but it does not seem to have occurred to him that he might have supplied him with the money he so greatly needed for his expedition to crush the English heretics and compel them to adopt his religious views. The Pope was the great resource relied on by the Jesuits, and they made him do all that a Pope could do for the ruin of their native land. For most of these Jesuits were Englishmen. The Pope was quite willing to utter spiritual fulminations and to place Elizabeth at the mercy of every scoundrel who, for any reason or for none, wished to kill her, but to give money, that was quite another affair. The Jesuits wanted to keep the business quiet, but their usual regard for secrecy and their usual skill in diplomacy, the blow should be struck. But if they could have concealed the hands which were preparing to strike it, if they could have made the Spanish fleet invisible until it arrived on English shores, they would have been content. The Pope was their great difficulty. They had implored him to be silent, and they had implored him to advance the necessary funds. But the Pope was not to know everything, and he he was not to know that the Jesuits had arranged to give the crown of England to Philip of Spain. A letter from Allen, the Jesuit and the promoter of the expedition, to Philip reveals all this. We are of opinion, he writes, that it will be well to say nothing for the present either to the Pope or anyone about your Majesty's succession. It cannot do good. It may do harm through the sinister interpretations of enemies and even friends. Prudent Jesuit. Even at the present day, popes prove troublesome to their followers, and the late Cardinal Manning complains that Pius IX, whom he helped to make infallible, could not be trusted with the secret and had become garrulous in his old age. France had also her eye on England. France was never, even in the latter ages, the very ready tool of Rome. France has not greatly affectioned the Jesuits. Affectioned the Jesuits. France had already put in her word against the Jesuit scheme and had advised the Pope against it. The Jesuit Morgan had reported to the Queen of Scots that the French king had been at hand with the Pope to provide that nothing be attempted against England. State papers quoted by Froude, History of England, volume 12, page 224. France was afraid lest England, after all, might be strong enough to defeat the Jesuits and the Pope and the King of Spain, that in the rebound the Catholic faith might suffer, and that France might suffer through her Protestant and cruelly persecuted subjects. Further, if the expedition succeeded, there would be the danger that Spain, if aroused by conquest, might annex French provinces. The Jesuits implored the Pope to be silent, but he would not. He talked to everyone of the plot, perhaps from pure love of talking, perhaps to relieve his troubled feelings. The only comfort the Jesuit had was that he, the Pope, was such a notorious liar that nobody believed a word he said. They wrote this to the Spanish king, and the original manuscript remained underlined by Philip in a manner which shows that he appreciated the communication. There was also another matter about which the Pope was so irritated that he even became hysterical and cursed and swore at his attendants and flung his dinner plates about. Altogether, the Jesuits had a hard time. Philip, we may presume, consoled himself with his relic of the shoulder bone, and he was never very much in earnest in the scheme. Possibly he understood the English better than either the Pope or his advisors. In the meantime, Allen never lost heart or ceased from pursuit of his object. He had already been made an archbishop. He looked to have a cardinal's hat and obtained it eventually, but the Pope never liked him, though he may have been too much afraid of all the powerful Jesuits to show his dislike openly. All that could be got from the Pope was the promise of 700,000 crowns, but even his moderate sum would not be given until Philip had actually landed in England. The Pope had at least profited by experience in dealing with sovereigns, even of his own faith. And then came the news of the execution of the hapless Queen of Scots. This scarcely changed matters. Mary was never of much account in papal plans as an individual, and we have seen that her piety and devotion to the church was not quite as much credited in her lifetime as it was since her death. A pope of the 19th century may canonize her, but the Pope of the 16th century was not very anxious to afford her the rights of the church in Rome after her death. But the Jesuits triumphed, and the Spanish Armada became an accomplished fact. But only to end in a most disastrous failure. Two things, however, are certain. The Spanish Armada was the exclusive work of the Jesuits. Neither the Pope nor the Spanish king would have taken the initiative if they had not been driven to it by the perseverant efforts of these disloyal Englishmen. English Catholics who suffered death or other penalties, either before or after this event, suffered solely for treason. If Rome today declares they suffered for their religion, she must admit that to commit treason is a religious duty when commanded by the Pope or other ecclesiastical superiors. Many of these so-called martyrs were men who were acting as spies in the pay and interest of foreign power, and would have been promptly hung or shot if they had carried out similar practices in ordinary warfare. Their actions were nonetheless treasonable towards their lawful queen because they were acts of loyalty to Rome. Their religion taught them to treason as a religious duty, and they only seek to throw dust in the eyes of the world when they cover all evil with a pretense of suffering for good. Yet, while Roman Catholics at the present day called loudly for sympathy with their martyrs, they show a very clear discernment of their views as to the fate which should be reserved for those who are what they consider disloyal to their head and rebel ever so mildly against his authority. If there was no other evidence of the character of men who suffered at this time for their attempts against the throne and peace of England, we may find full confirmation if Father Allen's correspondence with Philip of Spain. As a matter of importance, if we give a few extra letters from, no, a few extra, oh, I'm saying that wrong. As the matter of importance, what is wrong with me? As the matter is important, we give a few extracts from his letter here. He writes, "As soon as God shall have given your majesty victory, you can then allege your descent from the house of Lancaster." Philip was ambitious of the English crown. If it could be had without trouble, this is the bait held up to him by the Jesuits. For notwithstanding his love of relics, Philip was less zealous to fight for the church than for his own interest. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Cardinal Allen, was to be appointed to that office by the Pope, who gives his first vote, and whom all the Catholic peers will follow, can easily bring to pass what you desire. If the Pope will then acquiesce, and all will go as you desire. With the sword of the Lord and of Gideon you will chastise the English heretics." Unquote. But a public manifesto was necessary also. Allen prepared an important document which cuts the ground from under the feet of those who fancy they can make men of common sense believe the invaders of England did not want to make rebels of Englishmen or to change the dynasty. This document was printed in Flanders and was intended to be issued as a pastoral letter to the people of England by their new and self-appointed spiritual ruler, Cardinal Allen. Copies of this document were smuggled across the Channel and distributed amongst the Catholic party. The burden of the whole was the wickedness of Elizabeth. Her father had been excommunicated. She, therefore, for that and 100 other reasons, had no right to the throne. His Holiness confirms and renews the sentence of his predecessors against Elizabeth. Allen addresses the people of England thus: "Being of your own flesh and blood, His Holiness has chosen me for his legate, for the restoring of religion and the future ordering of the realm." A large office for one individual. He discharges you of your oath of allegiance and requires you no longer to acknowledge her as your sovereign. The angel of the Lord, he declares, will scatter the heretics, which at the event proved was precisely what the angel of the Lord did not do. He assures them that if they will but forsake their queen and hand their country over to his control, that their property will be spared. A weighty bribe for those who might have no settled religious convictions, but who might have a very settled desire to keep their possessions. If they took the side of their country and their queen and died in battle, they would certainly go to hell. Temporal bribes and spiritual punishments were well interspersed in the carefully prepared document. The heretics, he said, were, surely he knew better, but was not the lie written for good ends? The angel of the Lord will scatter them. This so important and self-confident document is dated from my lodging in the palace of St. Peter at Rome, the 28th of April, 1588, the cardinal. But the Lord fought on the other side, and we do not hear what view the Roman Catholic authority took of the failure of their promises and prophecies. We shall show later how much the English Catholics and the English Catholic priests dreaded and resented Jesuit plots and interference. The Jesuits had a plan, all their own, for reconciling the conscience of honest Catholics, and there were then, as there are now, many such disloyal devices. The bull disposing and excommunicating Elizabeth was the great difficulty. According to the law of the Roman Catholic Church, then as now, any Roman Catholic who obeyed the Queen disobeyed the Pope. To enter fully into the Jesuit system of morals would require a valium. It may be summed up in a sentence. The Jesuits offer the world at large a system of theology by which every law, divine and human, may be broken with impunity, and by which the very bulls of popes may be defied. It is a ghastly religion. It is a religion to be abhorred of all honest and honorable men. It may be said that the Jesuits of today do not teach these doctrines and do not practice this theology. Would to God that this was the case. We have already shown how recently they have brought forward with full approval and with an earnest recommendation the plan outlined by the Jesuit parson for the overthrow of the Protestant succession in England and for removing Protestants from all offices of state and introducing the Inquisition. This does not look like repentance for past crimes. We have quoted from the works published by the Jesuits at the present day, and the works of the Jesuit authors quoted in this present work are the class books of their colleges and of their schools and colleges. What then can be expected in the near future but civil war, religious anarchy, and the privation of Englishmen's dearly bought right of liberty of conscience? Lord Robert Montagu, who left the Church of Rome some few years since, has indicated not a few of the preliminary steps which have been taken to further the plans of Rome for the subjugation of England. He says, by the ballot act, the influence of the landlord was destroyed, while the power of the priest, which is exercised in the confessional by the threat to refuse absolution, was not touched. It was far indeed from being touched. It was simply secured. English statesmen have signed away their birthright of liberty for a mess of political pottage. A recent Jesuit writer, Father Amherst, has declared that the admission of Catholics into the legislation by the Emancipation Act of 1829 was the first great blow which Protestant ascendancy received. England has, indeed, been since called an essentially Protestant country, and no doubt there are many who would still so call it. But when Catholics were admitted to an equality in making of laws, the principle of a purely Protestant state was surrendered. Yep. We can now only briefly indicate the Jesuit teaching as to our duty to our neighbor and the duties which we owe to each other. But let it be remembered that what the Jesuits teach, the church teaches, and that the class books of moral theology written by the Jesuits are also the class books of all Roman Catholic colleges. And in all schools under Roman Catholic control, the same teaching is given. Before blaming the Irish people for crime and discontent, it would be only justice to them to remember that Maynooth has been endowed and is largely supported by the Protestant money, and that the priests who rule Ireland are taught there that it is no crime to remove a tyrant and no sin to refuse the payment of debts which man considers he need not pay. Really? Equivocation. Both Lingari and Guri teach that it is lawful to use equivocation or equivocation. That is language in which words or phrases of a double meaning are employed for a just cause and to confirm the equivocation with an oath. And he defines a just cause to be anything designed to maintain things good for the spirit or useful for the body. Quote, a man may swear that he never did such a thing, though he actually did it, meaning within himself that he did not do so on a certain day or before he was born, or understanding any other such circumstance, while the words which he employs have no such sense as would discover his meaning. And this is very convenient in many cases, a quite innocent, when necessary, a conducive to one's health, honor, or advantage. That is crazy, unquote. The same author suggests as surer method of avoiding falsehood, which is, after saying aloud, I swear that I have not done that, to add in a low voice, today. Or after saying aloud, I swear, to interpose in a whisper, that I say. Wow. That's like putting your fingers behind your back, crossing your fingers. I'm sorry. All right. Quote, a confessor, if asked by a tyrant whether Titus has confessed a murder, can and ought to reply, I know not, because the confessor knows it not so as to communicate it. Moreover, if the tyrant should persist and say, is it the case that you know not this by sacramental knowledge? He can still reply, I know not. The reason is because the tyrant well knows that he has not the right to ask this, neither does the confessor, as a man, know that he knows it, but as a vicar of God and with an incommunicable knowledge. That made no sense. Unquote. Theft. Thus, Gurry, in his chapter on the causes excusing theft, says, a man may, in extreme necessity, use of another man's goods as much as is sufficient to free himself from such necessity. The reason is that the division of goods, in whatever way it may have been made, cannot derogate from the natural right which belongs to everyone of providing for himself when he is laboring under extreme necessity. Whence, in such a case, all things become common, and therefore anyone taking anything belonging to another for his own relief takes a thing truly common, which he, are you serious? Which he makes his own, as happened before the division of goods. Therefore, he does not commit robbery, unquote. I've never in my life. The Reverend Daniel O'Hanlon Welch is reported in the Wexford People, October 7th, 1885, as saying, quote, if you are going to pay the rent, you must first of all consider your liability to pay the honest shopkeeper and make provision for yourself and family. I'm not going to tell you that you are bound to pay the surplus. I am merely telling you if you resolve on what to do, but if you think it prudent to put it in your pockets, you will have my blessing and support. Unquote. Quote, a man may steal the property of another, not only in order to relieve his own necessity, but also of that another. The reason of this is that he, as it were, acts for the needy person and shows that he loves his neighbor as himself. I can't even take it. Unquote. How did they do this stuff? All right. How nuns should act in hospitals. Oh, wait a minute. I forgot. Surely this is the making the commandments of God of no account. Amen. That's truth. How nuns should act in hospitals. A nun attached to a hospital is which not only Catholic, but also heretic patients are admitted, is requested by a Protestant grievously ill to bring to him a minister of his own sect, from which he may receive the aids of his own religion. But the nun does not know whether she can comply with his request. The question is asked, can the nun bring in a Protestant minister? The answer, no. The reason is evident, for it would be communication and cooperation, properly so called, with heretics in a matter pertaining to religion. This also follows from the following reply of the Holy Congregation, 15th March, 1848. Most Blessed Father, D.N., lays humbly before your holiness that in the city of M there is a hospital, of which he is rector and chaplain, in which nuns nurse the patients. But since from time to time the followers of an un-Catholic religion are admitted, who continually ask for a heretic minister for whom they may receive religious help and comfort, it is asked whether it is lawful for the aforesaid nuns to call in a minister of a false religion. It is also asked whether the same solution to be given in the case where a sick heretic is living in the private house of a Catholic. Whether then a Catholic can lawfully call in a heretic minister. The reply given to this by the inquisitors was that, according to what is laid before us, is not lawful. And they added, let them remain passive. No doubt some isolated cases may be found in which nuns will have complied with a request for a Protestant minister, because the church always considers expedience. But the rule is as given above. The same rule holds good in regard to Protestant children who are sent to Roman Catholic schools. It is the duty of the nuns to teach as much as possible the Roman Catholic religion, and this is always done no matter what promises are made to the parents, unless in cases where the risk of discovery would be too great and pecuniary loss might result to the nuns. Chastity. We do not propose to enter here into the subject. It is sufficient to say that the Jesuits condoned sins under his head quite as freely as they condone theft and murder. One example must suffice, and it is selected because the whole case was brought before the public tribunals and admits of no dispute. In 1817, Nimbauer, a Bavarian priest, was found guilty of murder of his mistress. In his confession of his guilt, he related at length how this woman, whom he had seduced, having threatened to denounce him to his ecclesiastical superiors unless he received her into his lodgings and provided for his child, he deliberately cut her throat while she was sitting with him in his room and gave her absolution as she expired. In explanation and justification of his conduct, he said in his confession of his crime, quote, "My honor, my position, my powers are being useful. That I valued in the world was at stake. I often reflected on the principle laid down by my old tutor, Father Sattler, in his Ethnica Christiania, a principle which he often explained to his young clerical pupils, that it is lawful to deprive another of life if that be the only means of preserving one's own honor and reputation. For honor is more valuable than life. And if it be lawful to protect one's life by destroying an assailant, it must obviously be lawful to use similar means to protect one's honor. My case appeared to me to fall precisely within this principle. I thought if this wicked woman should pursue me to Lauterbach and do what she threatens, my honor is lost. Father Sattler's principle became, therefore, my dictum praestitium. Her death has always been a source of grief to me, though the motives which led me to effect it were praiseworthy. These motives, my only motives, were to save the credit of my honorable profession and to prevent the many evils and crimes which a scandalous exposure might have occasioned. As these calamities could be prevented only by the getting rid of Anna Aschlitater, I was forced to get rid of her. The end was good. Her death was the only means. Therefore, I cannot believe that it was a crime." Wow. Wow. Unquote. Messed up people. The most painful feature in all this Jesuit teaching is the entire absence of any thought of God or of his law. All turns on the opinion of a few men and on their view of good or evil. And this system is being endowed with the wealth of a Protestant, or shall we rather say, of a Christian nation. Surely God will judge the supporters of such infamies, as well as those who perpetuate them. It might indeed be said with perfect truth that if St. Peter had gone to a Jesuit confessor, he would have found excuses for his denial of Christ, if not a complete justification, and that even the awful crime of Judas would have been excused, if not extenuated. The flogging mania of the Middle Ages. Religious manias break out from time to time, which are sometimes more dangerous in their results than civil war. The dancing mania was one of these scourges which went nigh to overset the mental balance of thousands. The flogging mania was a still more dangerous epidemic, and in this the Jesuits bore a considerable and guilty share. Devotees are always cruel, and Catherine de' Medici took up the lash and used it with effect on her hapless maids of honor. It need scarcely be said that she took care that no such suffering should be inflicted on herself. She indoctrinated her son, Henry III, with this passion also, and induced him to give added prestige to these abominations by assisting at them. Under Henry IV, a more sensible regime was commenced, and all these processions and expositions of religious immodesty were strictly forbidden. A public scandal occurred at the commencement of the 18th century, which gave a considerable blow to the Jesuits as a body. That some members of every association may and do prove unworthy is no argument against the rest. But if the evildoer is supported and his crime extenuated by his brethren, then indeed one must believe that they are partakers of his sin. Such was the case of the famous trial of the Jesuit father John Baptist Gerard, whose illicit amours under the cloak of religion with a very beautiful young woman named Catherine Cadry ended in a public trial and exposure. At first, the poor girl came to the father with an earnest desire for spiritual advice. After her fall, probably from a feeling of remorse, which even the priest's assurances failed to remove, then she became, as she supposed, possessed by the devil, and no doubt she was the victim of a terrible hysteria. No one could console her but this one particular father, and consequently he passed long hours with her alone, during which he was supposed to be occupied in exorcising the demon. Though long since forgotten, the scandal rang through the whole of Europe, and the result was a blow to the Jesuits, from which they did not soon recover. At the public trial, the unhappy woman was acquitted, for in order to shield her priestly paramour, the blame was thrown on her. It is said that great efforts were made to have her punished in some way, but the judges were resolute. They declared that they had acquitted the real culprit, and that they would certainly not pass even the slightest censure on his victim. The extent to which the practice of public scourging was carried during this century under the direction of the Jesuit fathers is a pitiful record of human weakness. The idea that the creatures of a good God could please him by self-mutilation or torture is sufficiently degrading. But when such humiliations involve acts of grossest immodesty, the source of the inspiration from which they proceed is self-evident. A disguised but nonetheless certain sensuality was concealed under all this mortification. We had almost said that the animal in man predominated, but animals are not guilty of such refinements of evil. Certainly, the administration of the Spanish. I'm sorry, guys. Forgive me. I'm sorry. Okay. Certainly, the administration of the Spanish discipline by the priest to the penitent became at last a source of terrible danger, not only to the order, but to the church, which permitted it, and in permitting it, sanctioned it. We must never forget that what Rome permits, she sanctions, because Rome has but to say the word, and at the moment her commands are obeyed. There are two kinds of discipline: the discipline sursum, the discipline dirosum, or the sanctium serpa, or the sanctium sub. The discipline was applied in the one case over or on the shoulders, and in the other case on the lower part of the body. This method of administering flagellation, God forgive me. Okay. The method of administering flagellation was called the Spanish discipline because it was introduced by the Spanish Jesuits. It is not to be supposed that the penitents of these fathers submitted all at once to the shameful exposure which was considered necessary. The fathers were indeed far too wise to proceed otherwise than cautiously. The soldiers, but slightly bared, were at first considered sufficient for the infliction, but as soon as the penitent had become accustomed to this mode of administering penance, more were required. In 1552, a community of women was formed in Louvain, where the Jesuit fathers had considerable influence, as indeed where they had not at this time. This community, which was composed of some of the ladies from the first families of Louvain, submitted to the Spanish discipline, and processions were organized and constantly carried out, in which these penitents walked through the streets scarcely clad and flogging themselves, or allowing themselves to be flogged until they bled. The matter was at last taken up by the professors of the university and by some of their secular clergy, and these processions, with the public administration of the discipline, were forbidden by law. At last, the scandal became so great, for the use of Spanish discipline had become a mania, and as infectious as such mania must always be, that the Archbishop of Toledo commanded that the book of spiritual exercises as used by the Jesuits should be revised. And in 1570, the Inquisition interfered and positively forbade these disgusting exhibitions. The Jesuits, however, were not to be silenced so easily. They at last increased their processions instead of causing them to be discontinued, and they found ready supporters amongst a number of ladies who walked the streets of Murcia, Toledo, Seville, Saragossa, and other towns in a state in which it might have been supposed that no self respecting woman would have allowed herself to be seen, and this was called the religion of Jesus. But though the Jesuits were obliged eventually to abandon these public processions and flagellations, they were still continued in secret and with worse consequences. Okay, thank you, Jesus. We're done. Next time we'll pick up in chapter 11. Keep your eyes on Jesus, brothers and sisters. Your nose in the book, which is the Word of God. And embed the Word of God upon the tablets of your hearts, so you and I will not sin against God or be deceived. I love you all. Bye-bye.